we get to have this relationship with you, that we get to have this community with each other. Be with us the rest of this day, Lord. Help us to be fearless in our lives and in our walks with you. Because that's not something that we need to have. That's not something from you. That fear is something we should just let go, walk with you in everything that you have for us, Lord. Be with us today. Be with Pastor Scott as he speaks to us this morning. We want to hear exactly what you have for us today. In your precious name, Lord. Amen. Amen.
Well, good morning. Glad you're here. It's good to be with you. I appreciate you allowing me to not be here last week. Good morning out in Toutle as well. Hope you guys are doing well. We'll see you out there tonight. Last week, Nikki and I were in Las Vegas while you were here. In fact, I was on the softball field while you were here. We were at Big League Dreams, the replica stadium. We played at Fenway. I was there for my senior adult softball, 40 and over, old guy softball. That's what I do. Yeah, it was a good day. Finished up on the Fenway replica, kind of a good thing. Nikki was at the pool. She hung out at the pool while I was playing softball because she's not as impressed with me as I want her to be. So that happens. But when we were there, I actually switched to a different team this year. And so I was with a new group of guys. The Northwest Legends is the team I was with. We finished 7th in that tournament. It was a big tournament, so kind of cool world tournament. But because I had moved to a new team, there were a lot of guys on the team I don't know as well. In fact, a few guys I met for the first time last weekend. And so we were in the middle of playing our games and doing things and getting ready for games. And in between games on, I believe it was Sunday morning, it might have been Saturday, but one of the guys was talking to another guy and decided to tell a joke. And I'm not going to repeat that joke because it was a pretty vulgar joke. It was pretty crass, to say the least. And one of the guys on my team looked over at him and said, "Dude, not in front of the preacher." And of course, a couple of the guys go, "Wait, what? He's a preacher?" And of course, what's funny is that always leads to the conversation. I went to church when I was a kid, and I've been, everybody wants to share with you, I'm not just the heathen that you think I am. It's pretty funny, and of course people apologize, and I'm so sorry that I said those things in front of you, blah, blah, blah. And again, that's not the first time that's happened to me. It happens to me a whole lot. It's one of the reasons that I say to people that I go out of my way to not tell people what I do for a living for as long as I can, because I know that as soon as they find out what I do for a living, a wall goes up, a barrier is put in place. And people feel like they have to act differently. They have to talk differently. They can't be who they really are. And I've always asked myself, okay, why does that happen? What's the reason? Where does the feeling come in that people think they need to change just because I'm a pastor? And I've had some people say to me, well, it's just because they want to be polite. They want to be polite. And they see you and they know that that's not something you're okay with, so they want to be polite. And maybe some people want to be polite. I'm sure there's probably some that's the case. But I think it's something much bigger. I believe that the reason that people operate that way, the reason that as soon as that joke started to get told, and my friend from the team that saw the joke happening as I was there, and his little heart started to panic, I think it comes from the fact that we have so spectacularly misrepresented Jesus to the world around us. For centuries, the church has pushed our expectations onto people who do not know Jesus or claim to follow him. We have expected people to behave in a way that makes us feel comfortable at all times, and especially in our presence, or else they be greeted by our unapproving gaze. At best. Our stern rebuke maybe is a little more likely. We've been called to be light in a dark world. But in most cases, we have been the ultimate killjoy. And now we have lost the right and the ability to be present, let alone influential in the lives of people. And as I read the Gospels, I don't see that in Jesus, right? I don't see somebody who people felt the need to completely, clean up their behavior around. And it's certainly not what we see in the story I want us to look at today. It's found in Matthew chapter 9. And if you have your Bibles, you can open it to Matthew chapter 9. It's also going to be up on the screen, both here and out in Tootle. Should be up on the screen there. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. It says this: As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. Anybody else find that fascinating? Like, he leaves out so many details, like follow me where? Like, hey, follow me. I found a place to get great fish. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I don't know. Nobody else reads their Bible that way? No? Cool. Maybe out in Tootle, anybody? All right, good. So while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Now, we've been in a series looking at the words of Jesus and trying to get an understanding of what he's really trying to communicate to us. And I want us to do that today from this really cool story. Isn't that a cool story? Yeah. They went to find fish and then they ended up at dinner. Cool story, right? They didn't really go to find fish. Come on, people, let's go. And now we can learn something from reading the story. And how many of you guys are familiar with this story? At least on some level, you've read through your Bible, right? Maybe it was in your YouVersion Bible devotional. Oh yeah, I've seen this one before, or you've at least heard it alluded to. And you can learn something from it just on the surface. But this is another one of those stories that you really need to dig a little deeper to understand some context, to understand all the things that are taking place in this story. And I think there's some things that Jesus wants us to know about who he is, but also how he wants us to respond to a story like this. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to notice the different characters that are mentioned in the story. Who takes place in this story? We got Jesus, and we have the Pharisees, who were this religious group, right? We have the disciples. We have a group of tax collectors and a group of sinners, and we have one more key figure, and who's that? We have Matthew, right? I can hear you all the way out in Tootle yelling Matthew. So not only is Matthew a part of the story, though, but what book did we read from? So what does that tell you? Not only is Matthew in the story, he wrote it. So he's got some pretty significant insight into this story that he can offer to us. Now, at first glance, it may seem like there's two different stories happening in this passage. There's a story of Jesus coming up to Matthew and saying, "Hey, follow me." And what's he doing? He's making an offer to become one of his disciples. That was a very common thing for a rabbi to ask a Jewish student to come and follow me, do things the way I do them. And so he's making that offer to him. And then we see them at a dinner party. And it feels a lot like two different stories, but they're connected for a specific reason, and they offer some greater understanding when you see these two things together and you go a little bit deeper, right? The first thing that we learn is that after Matthew, or the first thing we learn about Matthew is that he was where? He was in the tax collector's booth, and it's an important piece of information because Matthew is selling himself out in this passage. You might say, how? Well, he was a publicani, which means he served the occupying Romans against his own people as a collector of taxes. In all lands that were occupied by the Romans, locals could purchase a franchise that entitled them to collect taxes from visitors and their own people. So basically, you say, hey, I want to buy a franchise and I will become a tax collector. Okay? And so they had to collect a specific amount of taxes for the Romans, but they could collect above and beyond that for their own personal profit. And here's the thing, right? They had this power to tax, and it was virtually unlimited, and it was enforced by the Roman military, giving them freedom to extort money from their own people. They had a great deal of leeway and latitude, okay? But that's not all. Many of these tax collectors would accept bribes from wealthy people to reduce their taxes. So if you have to meet a certain number to pay the Romans, and you've taken a bribe from the wealthy people, how are you going to pay the Romans and still make a profit? You've got to take it from the poor and the middle class, and that's exactly what took place, is people would take more from the poor and the middle class. But it goes beyond that. The Jews believed that their only true government was a theocracy, right? That they should live under the kings, under the prophets, with God as the head. And so anyone who cooperated with the Romans was not just selfish, but they had also compromised their religion, meaning that they were traitors. And so these tax collectors, in the eyes of the Jews, were ceremonially, there we go, unclean. They were as swine, and they were therefore not welcome in the synagogue and forbidden to give testimony in any Jewish court. These guys were bad guys. But Matthew gives us a little bit more detail and more understanding. You see, there were two types of publicani. The first was called a gabai, and they collected general taxes, such as property and income taxes, the kind of things that people are like, okay, we know we're going to have to pay taxes on that. It's not fun. We don't like it. You may have some disagreement, but okay, we get it. The second was called a mox, and they had almost unlimited power to tax the people. They could levy a tax, for example, on a person's boat, on the fish he caught with the boat, on the dock where he unloaded the fish that he'd caught in the boat. They could tax a traveler's donkey. They could tax his servant. They could tax his goods. They could tax pretty much anything they wanted to. And again, remember, they had the power of the Roman military behind them to enforce this tax. So even if it didn't seem like all that great a tax, they could say, tough, you're going to pay it. And if you don't, the Roman military will throw you in jail. So you've got these two different kinds of publicani, of tax collectors, right? But there were also two different types of mox, right? You had the great mox, and these guys could hire men to collect their taxes for them. Now, what's the benefit of that? Well, if you're a Jew and you are collecting all these taxes that make people not like you very much, and you can get somebody else to do your dirty work for you, you can save some of your reputation. You can save a little face, right? People don't necessarily know what you are and what you do. But the second kind was a small moke, and these guys were the worst of the worst. These were the guys that you knew. They were face to face with you. They were collecting the taxes from you. You knew them. You knew they were a Jew. You knew they were taking from you. They were the ones sending the Roman military to come and get you and say, hey, give me your money. Okay? When we read that Matthew was sitting in the tax collector's booth, that tells us he was a small moke, right? He was one of these guys who had the ability to tax anything he wanted to, and he did it face to face. You saw him, you knew him. He was the guy taking your money from you, and so he was the most despised man in Capernaum. He's confirming, Matthew, by his own hand, I was the worst of the worst. And this is important for us to understand for a lot of reasons. One, because it tells us something about who Jesus is, that he invited this guy who's the worst of the worst, this small moke, this guy who was a traitor in the eyes of his own people. He invites this guy to be one of his followers, but not just one of his followers, one of the 12. And not just one of the 12, but one of the 12 who will write the Gospel of Matthew that will influence people throughout the history of the world. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? That this guy who is the worst of the worst, Jesus says, I want that guy to be a part of my leadership team. But it tells us something about Matthew. That he gave up more financially than any of the other disciples. The decision to follow Jesus cost him greatly financially. Like, this was not just some, I could kind of help Jesus on the side. Like, he gave it all up. He walked from an incredibly lucrative franchise to follow Jesus. That's pretty important. But that's not the only reason that these two stories are connected. Right after Jesus invites Matthew to follow him, without any kind of even transition, we see that they're at this party. But where's the party? Party was at Matthew's house, right? And who's at the party? The scripture tells us that it was tax collectors and sinners. What happened here is that Matthew invited his friends to come meet Jesus. He immediately makes the decision to follow Jesus and then says, hey, Jesus, come to my house, bring the disciples. I'm going to gather all of my friends, the tax collectors, the sinners, to come and spend time with me. He wants to introduce them to Jesus immediately. Now, we could do a whole sermon on that, couldn't we? The idea that as soon as you come to faith in Jesus, you tell everybody about him. But what stands out to me, the thing that's cooler to me about that, even than that he told all of his friends about Jesus, the thing that I think is beneficial for us, is that when Matthew says that this dinner was with a bunch of tax collectors and sinners, you might have the mindset, if you just read your Bible, that, this religious guy who was writing a story is using derogatory language to speak about this group of people. There was just a big group of tax collectors and sinners that Jesus was having dinner with. That's not what's happening. Matthew is writing, right after I came to faith in Jesus, I had Jesus and the disciples to my house and all of my friends. Sinners, tax collectors. He wasn't talking about all the heathens from town. He was describing his friends. And to describe them, he uses this Greek word, hamartoloi, which is translated sinner, and it referred specifically to those who had no respect or concern for either the Mosaic law or rabbinic traditions. They were considered the vilest and most worthless of all people. And so, again, he's not just jumping to a conclusion. These were his friends. He knew them. He could describe them pretty well. And he does so. But what I think is most important is not only is he describing them, he's describing himself. He was one of them. So it tells us a lot about who he was and about who these people were. And so we know we have these vile, evil, worst of the worst people hanging out at this dinner. And who's there? Jesus is there. Hanging out with the most worthless people in town in the home of the most worthless guy who had been stealing and taking from people, extorting. Like, he's this bad dude. And yet Jesus just invited him to be a part of his leadership team. And he was planning to use him to change the whole world. So with some of that context, what does that teach us about the person of Jesus? I think there's two things that we can learn from this story about the character of Jesus. And then I want to share with you a few things that we're supposed to do in response. So, two things we learn about Jesus. The first thing I want you to pay attention to is that Jesus is a healer. Jesus is a healer. I think it's interesting that the analogy that he used to describe himself was doctor. And that tells us a great deal about who Jesus is. He came to seek and save lost people, to heal, to restore. And as he sat among these sinners, he wasn't pointing out their faults or requiring them to conform to his preferences. He saw people who needed to be healed, and he knew the best place for him to be was among them. Right? It's like a doctor who does like Doctors Without Borders, right? They're going to go to a place where there are all kind of sick people. Doesn't that make sense? If you're a healer, you would be where sick people are. Makes a lot of sense that we would do that kind of thing. But I don't think the majority of sinners in the world see Jesus as a healer. Remember, the definition of that word, sinner, is incredibly important. These were people who had no respect or concern for either the Mosaic law or the rabbinic traditions. What's another way to word that? They weren't church people. Right? They didn't respect it. They didn't honor it. They didn't acknowledge it. They weren't church people. They weren't us. They weren't part of our thing. They were living their lives as they saw fit to live them. And I think all of us know people that fit that description today, don't we? Do we all know people that would fit that description? They have no respect for I don't have any respect for church or God or any of that kind of stuff. But how many of those people would believe that Jesus would want to be with them? How many of those people would be like, oh man, I'd love to hang out with Jesus. I think that'd be great. We typically get the opposite, don't we? Like, we see people that say things like, oh, if I ever came in the church, the building would fall down. You ever met those people? Oh man, I've done all these terrible, and that's some of the guys I played ball with, right? Like, oh boy, you told that joke in front of the preacher? You should be lucky the lightning didn't strike you, right? Like somehow God's going to zap somebody because I got offended. Even though I wasn't offended. The problem is for way too many people, Jesus is the source of guilt, of judgment, or condemnation. And there are a lot of people who would go out of their way to avoid a dinner party with Jesus. But in this story, we see that these sinners were happy to come and meet Matthew's new friend. And Jesus was just as happy to be there with them. And I guarantee you that at no point in the dinner did Jesus make a speech about, hey, look, here's the do's and the don'ts. You can talk about this, but you can't talk about that. I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to read into the text. I'm going to guess maybe a vile and vulgar joke got spoken at some point at dinner. Do you think that's possible? Probable? They're hanging out. They're having dinner. Somebody told a dirty joke. I'll guarantee it. And there's nowhere in the scripture we see Jesus said, so why do people see Jesus as condemning rather than as a healer? It's because we, his body, have represented him that way. It's because we've required people to conform to our level of comfort, both inside of buildings like this and outside of them. We've expected people to fall in line. We've expected people to do the things we expect them to do. But that's not how Jesus wants people to see him. He wants everyone to know that he's a healer and that when they're ready to acknowledge that they need a doctor, they can come to him. But it's bigger than just the fact that he's this healer, right? His healing is complete. And Matthew's story is such a great story because he goes from sitting at the tax collector's booth, a traitor, the vilest of the vile, the worst of the worst, despised, to this guy who Jesus says, I'm going to use you. You're going to be one of the 12. You're going to be part of my team. You're going to write this gospel that changes, right? That's amazing. That his healing is never just minor. It's always total and full and complete. And what that tells me and what we need to understand is that Jesus doesn't just tolerate sinners. He seems to be crazy about them. And he seems to be somebody who loves being around them. And that's a big thing for us to understand about the character and the person of Jesus. And if we're people who represent him in any way other than that, that's a problem, isn't it? Jesus is a healer. But the second thing we can learn from this story is that while Jesus is a healer, he's also incredibly harsh. Jesus is harsh. Now, I can't tell you how hard that is for a lot of people to accept. Because we love this Jesus, don't we? I don't know where in Longview it's right here. I don't know where in Tootle. Where's it at? But the picture of Jesus is up there right now. That's what we want, don't we? This pretty, long flowing hair poet Jesus with his beautiful eyes. And he walks around and he's just, soft and picking up babies. And he's just the greatest politician of all time, right? He's mild-mannered and just, oh, Jesus, you're so wonderful. No wonder the darkness trembles because you're so wonderful. But that's not Jesus at all. And while Jesus is always kind, that kindness doesn't always come in a package that we like all that much or that we can accept. Now, you may be sitting here going, Scott, what on earth are you talking about? Where in this passage is Jesus harsh? What does that have to do with tax collectors and sinners? You just said the exact opposite, that he loves hanging out with those people, right? Well, once again, what do we need? We need context. Remember, Jesus was at Matthew's house for a dinner party with a bunch of sinners and tax collectors, and it must have, caused kind of a stir in town because the Pharisees caught wind of it and they show up. But they don't go to Jesus. Did you notice that? It doesn't say that they confronted Jesus. It says that they grabbed some of his disciples and pulled them aside and said, hey, what's the deal with Jesus? Now, let's be clear. They weren't asking a question because they wanted an answer. They were trying to make an accusation, right? What's he doing? He's hanging out with these guys that are the worst of the worst, the vilest of the vile. They're unclean. But it's somehow, some way, Jesus overhears this conversation and he chimes in. And he says, hey, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now you might be going, okay, Scott, I still don't get it. Where's the harshness? Jesus seems soft and nice. And he's just saying that he desires mercy. That's easy, right? Well, it sounds fine to us, but it would have been incredibly offensive to the Pharisees, and here's why. That phrase, go and learn, was a commonly used phrase in rabbinical writings, and it was used to rebuke those who did not know something they should have known. They would write, go and learn, and it was meant to mean, hey, you should already know this, stupid. But let me explain it to you again. And so Jesus hijacks their own word, their own phrase, and says to them, hey guys, go and learn. This thing you should already know, go figure it out. Right? Incredibly offensive. It was a put down. It was a call out. He was not privately rebuking them in front of the whole group. All these bad guys who think, oh, we have no right to be in the room with the Pharisees, probably watching their mouth when the Pharisees showed up, right? Oh, those guys are going to just more fuel for the fire for why they hate us. Jesus makes a spectacle of them saying, hey, you guys should know this. I'm imagining all these sinners going, whoa. That's pretty cool, right? Seeing these guys get theirs a little bit. Because he absolutely calls them out in front of everybody. He exposed their ignorance of God's true nature and their failure to follow his very clear and basic commandments. And that's harsh, but guess what? It gets worse. Because, and this is again where context is important, he quotes from the book of Hosea. Specifically from the book of Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, which is an even greater dig. And you say, well, why? Well, what's the story of Hosea about? The story of Hosea is about a prophet that God said, hey, I want you to go and take an adulterous wife. And he uses Hosea, the prophet, who continually takes back this wife who cheats on him, and he takes her back, and she cheats on him, and he takes her back. And it's an illustration of the relationship God has with Israel, who continually cheats on him, and he takes them back. And they cheat on him, and he takes them back over and over and over and over, right? It's an incredible story of the mercy and the forgiveness of God. And though Hosea had every right to be judgmental and condemning, he could have absolutely said enough with his wife. God called him to show compassion. And so by alluding to Hosea, Jesus is calling them out as judgmental. He's pointing out their hypocrisy. And they would have been incredibly aware of what he was saying, and everyone else at the dinner would have been too. He's absolutely saying, you guys should know this. And he's saying, you're a bunch of judgmental hypocrites who don't know the most basic thing about God. If your entire identity is based off the idea that you're the experts about God, and this guy calls you out in front of a group of people saying, you should know it, and you don't. It's about as bad as it gets, isn't it? It's important to understand that Jesus can speak harshly. But it's just as important to understand and to recognize who he speaks harshly to. This story is no anomaly. He reserved his harshest statements for those who considered themselves righteous but weren't, rather than those who refused to recognize the authority of God in their lives and did whatever they pleased. I think many people in the church do the exact opposite. We are harsh with those outside the church and unwilling to call out those who are inside. We look at people who have never made a claim to know Jesus and we say, well, you better clean it up. But we look at people inside the church and go, well, you do whatever you want. Go ahead. Because you're saved by grace. Right? Is that really what it is, or is it just, I don't want to make things uncomfortable? Probably a little more the latter than the former. So with that understanding, how should we respond? What does Jesus expect of us? Well, I think he wants us to respond in three ways, and I'll go through these quickly. The first is that we must acknowledge our total and complete dependence upon Jesus. Now, it's funny. Jesus said he didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. And at first glance, that might sound like, okay, wait a minute. Jesus left some people out, right? Jesus only is calling some people. Righteous people aren't welcome. He is only allowing sinners to come. That seems unfair, doesn't it? What about all those righteous people? They're just out of luck? That doesn't seem right. Well, Jesus wasn't leaving anybody out. He didn't come to call righteous people. Do you know why he didn't come to call righteous people? There are none. There are none. All of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. If I might be so bold as to translate for Jesus, what he's saying is, I came for those who recognize that they are sick, and those who believe they are not, those who believe they are righteous, will have no place at my table. The Pharisees thought they were fine. They believed they were good enough. And so they were unwilling to come to Jesus to ask for the life that only he can give. As I read this story, I see that Jesus wants me, that Jesus wants you to recognize that we're desperate for him. I am incapable of saving myself. I am unable to live in such a way as to earn my own salvation. I need Jesus. I needed him the first time I received him. And church, let me tell you, I need him just as desperately right this minute. Nothing has changed. Not 30 years of walking with Jesus. I need Jesus just as much today as I ever have. And I think it's a problem in the church. I think we get into the church, we've been here so long that we get to this point where we just think, I can kind of run this myself. I can kind of run my own life. I got this. When we were first saved, we recognized that we were sick, right? We recognized how desperately we needed the Lord. But now we're pretty clean looking, aren't we? I mean, let's be honest. Compared to the rest of the world, we're pretty clean, aren't we? We look pretty good, don't you? How do you guys think you look pretty good? Toodle? You guys look pretty good? Hondo does. Toodle? You guys look pretty good? I mean, you're not sinners like those guys, are you? You wouldn't tell a dirty joke in front of the pastor, would you? I think that what Jesus is calling us to is to acknowledge our need for him. I think what he's calling us to is to say, I am hopeless and helpless without you. To recognize that we were sinners. To recognize that there's no point in time where I can say I am no longer dependent upon the person, the grace, the mercy of Jesus. I need you. I need you. I need Jesus just as desperately today as I ever have. Now, you've heard me, if you've been a part of our church for any amount of time, you've heard me say that Jesus changes our identity and that we should see ourselves as children of God rather than referring to ourselves as sinners, right? You've heard me say that recently, that he changes our identity, that in the New Testament, we never see the people of God calling themselves by the name of sinner. We are now children of God, and that's true. Absolutely. I don't want you to think of yourself as a sinner, but we must never forget what made us his children, how we got this new identity, and why we remain his children. We are completely dependent on Jesus, and that will never change. And Matthew understood that, but the Pharisees missed it. They missed it. It's what we talked about 2 weeks ago. They wanted to say, their plan was to stand in front of God and show them their resume. Look at how good we've done. We've got this. Guys, I don't know about you. Here's my plan. When I stand before the Lord at the end, I'm going to say, I've done nothing of any value. I've done nothing that would cause you to love me or want me. I've done nothing to earn my place to be here. I am completely and totally dependent on the mercy and the grace of God. And I put my faith in Jesus to get me here. Nothing else. Nothing else. He came for the sick, not the righteous. He came for people that would acknowledge, I just need you. You're my only hope. You're my only hope. It's the first thing. The second thing is that if that is true, we must follow the example of our Savior and extend the grace of the healer to sinners. We are the body of Christ. We've been called to represent him, to do what he does, to show the world who he is. As I said earlier, we've not always done a good job with this. And in a lot of ways, I think it's because we haven't done the first thing. We've forgotten how desperately we need Jesus. And so we've looked down on other people, all the while forgetting that it's Jesus who saved us. We have no right and no reason to be proud, to think that somehow we're better than anybody else. And yet, church, let's be honest, we do that, don't we? We walk around like, well, I'm better. And you would never say it out loud, but it's true, isn't it? How many of you guys have ever been there where you've honestly thought, I'm better? My hand's up. Me and Kane. Okay, a couple of us. There have been times, man, I've looked at people and said, I'm better than you. I have. It's easy to do. And that causes us to be able to look down on people. But the same salvation from the same Savior is available to all of us. And when we remember that it's Jesus who saves us, we're able to offer that grace to others. But let me be clear, Jesus didn't just tolerate sinners. He ate with them. He invited them to be on his leadership team. He wasn't disgusted by them. He was happy to be with them. Can I tell you, when I go play softball with the guys I go play softball with, I never ask them to do anything different. Ever. And I don't say, well, you got to be good. Like, I'm there. I'm present. I'm happy to be with them. They're happy to be with me. And I want them to be who they are. And any change that comes has to be because they've fallen in love with Jesus, not because they want to make me feel comfortable. If you see sinners as a charity case, you've already missed it. We have to be people who are excited to be with people that aren't disgusted by sinners, but that follow the example that Jesus set. Let me ask you, are sinners comfortable around you? If not, why not? Here's one thing I can say. Sinners are comfortable around me. They find out what I do for a living and they're uncomfortable for a little bit. And then they get to know me a little better and then they're fine. And that might be the path you follow too. They're comfortable around you. They find out you're a follower of Jesus. And they're uncomfortable for a little bit, but then they realize, wait a minute, they're okay. I told you earlier, I go out of my way to not let people know what I do for a living for as long as I can because I want to build up as much track record as I can so that when they hear, oh, that guy's a pastor, they go, whoa, no way. But then they're like, yeah, but I know that guy, he's cool, it's all right. We need to be people that people go, no, it's okay. Now, that doesn't mean that we start, hey, I'm going to sin too. I'm going to do all the things they're doing. I'm going to tell my dirty joke too because it's a really good one. That's not what I'm saying. I don't have to participate to be present. And here's what I found. Most people aren't going to ask you to. I've never once had a guy tell me, we don't want you if you won't get drunk with us. I've had guys try to get me drunk. They're like, dude, that'd be so cool. I'm like, not for me. Sinners should be comfortable around you. As followers of Jesus, we must offer his grace to everyone. And that means there's no room for judgment or condemnation. We must see the most desperate sinner as someone who is loved by Jesus and extend that love to them. But the third thing that I take from this, the thing that I think Jesus wants to do in response, is that we have to be willing to call out the self-righteous. We tend to be harsh, as I said earlier, with those who do not know the Lord and patient with those who say that they do. But sometimes, guys, we got to say things that people don't want to hear. Sometimes we need to call out that person who's making it difficult for lost people to find Jesus. Sometimes we need to speak harshly to someone who does not know something they should know. Why don't we? I touched it earlier. I think there's a lot of reasons. We might be afraid of losing relationship. We may be insecure about how much we know or how holy we are, right? Well, if I say something, they're going to come back at me. We may be afraid of them pointing out our own failures. And can I tell you a little dirty little secret? Is this okay? Can I tell you a dirty little secret? For pastors and leaders, do you know one of the reasons we don't want to call people out? They might leave the church and not give money anymore. I'll say it louder. They might leave the church and not give money anymore. Oh! Do you know the church has bills? Can I soapbox for a second? Is that okay? Tootle? Nobody in Tootle objected that I could hear, so we're good. I hear some people talk about how the church just wants your money, right? And you guys know, if you know me at all, I hate that. That drives me crazy, and we fight that concept. If the church has these giant coffers of money somewhere, somebody needs to tell me where they are. Okay? The reality is the church, like any other thing, we have bills to pay. We got to pay for the building and power and staff and, all the different things that we got to pay for. In the 12 years I've been at Exodus, we live on that line constantly, right? We've always lived on that line. And so there are realities for pastors, and I think this is a real thing, for pastors and people on boards that are responsible. There is a sense of fear that sometimes can take place that, hey, if people left that give money, we might not have enough to pay people's salaries. We might not have enough to keep lights on. That's a real fear that I think happens to some people. And it's not okay. I'm not justifying it. I'm just telling you, I think that's one of the things that hits people's minds sometimes. Is, oh no, if I say something, now here's the good news about our church. I have no idea what anybody gives at all. So I can say anything I want to. But I think those are realities. We have all these fears. We're afraid of those kinds of things. We're afraid of losing relationship. There's all these different things. But if we're honest, we could tie it all up in one bow, and it's selfishness. I'm thinking about me instead of thinking about you. Make no mistake, when Jesus was harsh with the Pharisees, that was the kindest thing he could do for them. It was for their benefit. Hey, you guys are going the wrong way. And sometimes we have to be harsh with people for their sake. And it might make you uncomfortable. It might cost you something. But sometimes we have to be harsh with people. But again, who was Jesus harsh with? He wasn't walking around looking at poor people saying, hey, get up and get a job, man. Stop, mooching off the system. That's not what we see in Jesus, is it? He's telling religious people, stop counting on your own self-righteousness. Stop looking down on people. That's who Jesus was harsh with. Not sinners, not people who didn't identify with Jesus. The people who were self-righteous, that's who he was harsh with. And there are times, guys, that we need to do the same thing, and it's the most loving thing we can do for them. Now, I'm not telling you to go into the foyer today and start blasting people, okay? I don't want to walk out there and have you be like, you and you and you. That's not what I'm saying. In this story, we see the heart of Jesus. It's a heart to heal and to restore. And that's my hope, right? Is that we would be people who represent Jesus well, as a healer, as a restorer. That people who are broken, people who don't identify with Jesus would say, man, there's healing in the person of Jesus, not condemnation.